So for the next few exercises, we're going to be using the white paper, also known as point paper. Point paper has these markings on this side, which can help you with aligning your grain lines. You always want to write on the white side of the paper versus the side with the markings. The reason is, again, if you were to digitize this, these little markings may look like a notch and may alter your a computer's interpretation of your pattern. It can be confusing to a team that you're working with. So we're going to next transfer our waist dart into what's called the French position. The French position is in this lower part. It's below the apex line. It's about 3/4 of the way down from the apex line in this side seam area. The first step you always need to do is establish your grain line. So I'm going to use my L square here. You can also use your graph ruler, squared ruler to do that. And then I'm going to hook up my center front sloper to the grain line. Remember, you want to be right on top of the line, not inside or outside. I'm going to use my weights here to secure it. And then the step 1, always establish your grain line. Step 2, mark your new dart position. So here we're doing the French dart. It's about 3/4 of the way down from your apex line here on the side. So I'm marking my sloper. And then the second step is we always want to trace off from new to old. So we're always tracing to this first dart leg. I'm going to go from this side seam at the French position through the armhole. I pick up my armhole notch, my shoulder seam, my neckline. I have my center front here to my first dart leg. Step 3, put my pencil in my apex line, and now I need to pivot the dart closed. So I'm rotating this so that the dart leg closed, that hooks up with that dart notch. And now step 4, I need to trace from new to old. So I'm back here at my French dart position, side seam, waist to that dart leg. Make sure I've marked that there and there. Now I take this away, make sure I've labeled this so I know this is my center front. And now you can make sure I have marked very clearly where my apex is, the bust point. So, as you can see here, I'm going to need to blend my waist. So I'm going to come back. I will be drawing it in red for you, but so you can see the difference. But for yourselves, you'll be using your pencil and blending it back. And the next thing we need to do is find our new dart center. So I'll pull my graph ruler here, and I want to identify the middle between these new dart legs. Again, this is the French position. This is at the side seam below the apex line, about 3/4 of the way down. So I mark halfway between these new dart legs. That is my dart center. I can create an invisible line here that will be the center of this dart. Oh, can you even see these? Now we need to shorten the dart. So I want to back off 5/8 of an inch from my true apex. I use my graph ruler here. I mark 5/8 of an inch to my new dart apex. This is 5/8 of an inch away from the center. This was my true dart apex. This is my new dart apex. And now I'm going to connect this new apex to my dart legs. So I'm going to use my graph ruler here, and I'm going to connect this leg and this leg. And we know that the punch line for that dart is going to be 1/2 inch away. This will be that circular punch mark that you see on your pattern. And now we need to true the dart excess. So I'm going to cut out my pattern here so that it's easier to manipulate. The first thing we do to true this dart is to fold it on the apex. So I'm going to on the new dart apex, which is the shortened 5/8 one, I simply do a small pinch here. Next, I need to fold on the dart legs. Remember, the seam allowance, by the law of gravity, is always going down into the bottom hem. So we want to fold on that first dart leg. Crease that. Now, this is, or pattern making is like origami. Very similar in process. I'm going to fold on my dart leg. I hook up those two legs so we're one on top of each other. And now I need to make sure I true my dart legs. So I want to make sure that this is straight. You can see that there's been some change there. So I want to make sure that this side seam is straight. I'm using a red pen, but you'll just use your pencil so that you can clean it up easily. And I want to make sure that that dart excess is captured correctly, so I'm going to use my tracing wheel over the dart. And if I were to leave this as excess fabric, you could see this triangle here. I'll put I'll just put a dash line so you can see where that tracing wheel line is. But, so some places for your first sample, you might want to keep that. But that's very bulky. So this is why we take it out with the seam allowance. Now I can go back in and true up all the other corners. So I want to make sure all my other corners are squared and perpendicular. So the underarm portion here, I want to make sure that that is squared with the side seam. I want to make sure that this armhole is blended. I want to make sure that this shoulder line is squared and perpendicular to one another. Same thing with the neckline, same thing with the center front. So before you trace off your seam allowance, you want to make sure everything is squared and true. Now we can go ahead and add seam allowance. Remember the rule of seam allowance. If the center front is on the fold, we don't need seam allowance, but we do need to mark our grain line. So the grain line is always parallel to what we drew. I'm going to mark this as center, front, on fold. And our rule of seam allowance, remember here at the neckline, it's always 1/4 inch. At the shoulder, at the armhole, and at the side seam, it's 1/2 inch. And here at our waist, if this is a shirt, this is going to be our hem. Our hem is 1 inch. Our dart legs will be 1/2 inch. So now I'm going to go through and draft my seam allowance. Half inch on the shoulder, 1/2 inch on the side seam. Remember, you're using the side seam that you blended and made true. 1/2 inch on my dart legs. Now, notice that the dart legs will not seam allowance. You don't want them to go past the intersect point. 1 inch on my hem. So here again at the center front, remember this is always perpendicular and squared to make sure you have smooth sewing. You can start with the dash line, and the side seam also should be perpendicular and squared to ensure smooth sewing. Same thing here at the top of the shoulder. So the top of your neckline is always 1/4 of an inch. And I'm going to connect the dots marks around the neckline to help me when I go to draft the seam allowance. It's perpendicular and squared at the center front grain line, 1/2 inch perpendicular and squared at the shoulder for the armhole. I'll do my dash lines around the armhole to ensure I have a nice smooth guideline to trace off. Then I come back with my curve tools to help me complete the process and connecting the dots. For the neckline, and then the same with the armhole. This is called a sleigh ruler. And you want to smooth and blend your lines. You'll come back in with your eraser tool and clean everything up so it's nice. You don't want to extend any lines, the guidelines. The idea is to have a smooth, continuous line as possible. Neatness is uber critical for effective pattern making. Consistency, neatness, making sure everything is smooth and clean and true. We'll make sure that this line down here, we're following our new guideline that we cleaned up and trued. Same thing here with this side seam. And then, once you've cleaned up and added all your seam allowance, next is notches. So I'm going to come back in and notch. I'm going to use my Sharpie here so you guys can see more clearly. So I have to finish my bottom hem here for a second. Nice smooth lines. Okay, notches. Start at the hem, move your way through the garment. It's the best way to be consistent. So first thing first, bottom hem. Always notching my seam lines. Notching the hem height. Notching where my dart starts on the side seam. Notching where my armhole starts on the side seam. Now remember, this here, armhole notch. We need to transfer this armhole notch into the seam allowance. Then I have the top of the seam allowance here where the armhole starts and my neckline. When you open this piece up and now it's on a folded piece of paper, you will have a notch here for the center front for your grain line. So then, now that we've added our notches, we need to come back and label it. So first is your name. Then we need to identify what this pattern piece is. So this was my front bodice with French dart. My marker is dying. Then we need to identify how many we're cutting. So this is cut 1 on fold, year and season, and the size. Name, what it is, how many are we cutting, year and season, and size.